everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Decade podcast. In this episode that we're releasing today, we had the great pleasure of talking with a remarkable woman named Rebecca Oliver. Rebecca has great experience on a multinational level, and she describes herself as a sustainability strategist. Her passion lies within finding knowledge in all its places that it can be found, and to use that knowledge to create a better future for the people and the planet. In our conversation with Rebecca, we talked a lot about sustainable finance and how businesses can make sound business choices in regards to their sustainable development. So without further ado, I give you our next episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Decade podcast. We're here today with Rebecca Oliver, which is a great honor. And how are you today, Rebecca?
I'm fine. We see a bit of sunshine today, so it's been a few days. So that makes me more energetic.
And where are you sitting?
I'm sitting in Stockholm, in the south of Stockholm, and staring out at some beautiful trees.
Nice. For those of you that don't know you, I wanted to bounce the question off to you that to try and answer, who are you, Rebecca Oliver, in 2020?
That's a question I've been spending some time trying to work out, so I'm not sure I have the answer, but I'm the current result of all what I've been through, and that's been a career that has taken me through multinational companies, foundations, academic organizations, and now in 2020 I'm working out how I can put all of that to the most impactful use. So that's where I am, and in order to do that I've become an associate at a wonderful little company called Purple Ivy, who work together with business to really try and find the way forward in a sort of transformative approach to sustainability. And that suits me just fine.
And how would you describe that work with Purple Owie? What does it look like when you come in and try to help organizations?
I think the most important thing, and I think a lot of people who are wondering about how change takes place, the most important thing is to understand the reality of that business, really understand where they're at, what their constraints are, what their room for maneuver is, where the potential is. And that's an exciting process. And that's why I wanted to move back into business, because I'm very interested in reality. I'm not so much a wishful thinker. I can dream, but I don't think dreaming is the same as wishful thinking. And so I like to get feet firmly on the ground while you're building your future. Start from there.
And you say back into business, which makes me curious to hear more about your background, because I happen to know that you started out in academics and the field of biology, and now you're working with sustainability in business.
Well, no, biology is just where I ended up in my education. So right from the beginning, I was very much an all-rounder and found it very, very difficult. The English education system demands that you drop certain subjects around the age of 14 and focus on what was then called O-levels. I had such a struggle there because I found every single topic fascinating. So I was a bit of a multi-nerd. And you could maybe call it a polymath, because I might refer to polymaths again in this conversation.
I kind of like the term multi-nerd.
And so I was a musician. Music has always been and was, particularly at school, a huge part of my life. But I was also in a lot of the sports teams of the school. So I was and doing gymnastics and all kinds of stuff. So I found it really difficult to decide what to study. And I did my, from 16 to 18, a total focus all in on music, but discovered that my passion for biology, which I think I got from my dad, I know I got from my dad, really began to sort of pop up and wave at me frantically from the side. And I realized that I would want to always have music in my life, but I needed to maybe study something else. And I had a good advice actually from a music teacher who said to me, for music and musicians, if you can imagine doing anything else, do it, because you can always have music in your life as a hobby. But if you do music, you can't have biology as a hobby or chemistry as a hobby or whatever. And it was the best advice, because musicians need to be single-minded, and I really wasn't single-minded, and I will never be single-minded.
So you started out studying biology then in Great Britain, and then now you're in Sweden, and then it seems like a bit of a transition between those 2 points. And I'm just curious, where did the interest for sustainability start?
So my mother is from the north of Sweden, from the wilderness part of Sweden. And when you live up in the wilderness, the relationship to nature is absolutely automatic. You can feel every single change. You can feel your reliance on plants and animals and natural systems. And so my mother, very early on in the 70s and maybe even before, she has simply not understood any way of developing what humans do that destroys nature. And that's just been an automatic part of my whole family's approach to living. We use as little synthetic material as possible. If it couldn't biodegrade, we were just very aware of it. And I think that awareness came strongly from my mother. Love of the knowledge, the detailed knowledge, what plants are called, what trees are called, how ants organize, how bees dance. That I got from my father, because he was a passionate natural historian, is what it's called in the UK. So that's where that came from. I didn't take a straight line from England to Sweden. I went via Italy. And you asked me what I mean when I say going back to business and industry. When I was working in Italy, I was based at Unilever, one of their international product development centers. And those were the years that I think are as important part of my education about reality as my degree in biology, and as important part of my understanding how you communicate as my master's degree in the communication of scientific ideas. So I felt that working on risk management, crisis management at Unilever was as important as my years at university.
That's very interesting to hear. And what comes up to me is that I really want to go into that and hear more about that experience. But before we leave kind of your start, I would just like to hear your thoughts if there's any analogies that you've seen from natural systems and your knowledge within that into the fields of business. And I'm really curious about your view on systems thinking.
Well, I think when I talk to a lot of people, the people who have the easiest time with systems are often people who have studied biology or ecology. I think that a lot of the development of our knowledge, I have a little diagram in my head where the way we understood the world started very much through polymaths, people trying to understand the system, looking at how everything linked up, naturally understanding the co-development of things and the interrelationships and the interdependencies. And then with the scientific method and the era of the Enlightenment and Descartes, who developed the scientific method, reductionism emerged. And that made it possible to break everything into components and study them separately. And obviously that has a huge amount of development has happened through that way of understanding the world. Now we're reaching a point where we absolutely have to put it all back together again. The sciences have merged. Understanding biology has taken us into chemistry, and understanding chemistry has taken us into physics. And understanding physics has always been deeply embedded in maths. And how we do maths has influenced how we think and what we can look at and what we can understand. And one of the people I most enjoyed talking to is a mathematician called Brian Arthur, who was one of the founding members of the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity Science. And he's recently written a paper about the evolution of maths. And it's absolutely fascinating. You look at geometry, which helped you describe things. And then came along algebra, which was part of trade. And what he says is that we're entering a new era where our maths is informed by algorithms. And if you use algorithms, it opens up a completely new area. It makes biology understandable in a way that you can't really use the maths we had before to really fully understand things like evolution and the development and building and of proteins and all of the details of biology. So just maybe a better way to describe that is just to quote Brian Arthur. He says, "The new algorithmic system of expression brings new problems within the reach of science." And I think that's the interesting thing about systems is that they are incredibly difficult to study. And so from having broken up everything up into its component parts, we're now having to put it all back together again. And that's not easy. And in every part of society, we've become accustomed to simplifying. And business is similar. Business has been really simplifying in order to go fast. And the results of that have been both fantastic and awful. So we've developed fantastic solutions to a lot of human problems, and at the same time, we're actually destabilizing the Earth systems, potentially catastrophically. So we were talking about systems thinking. I mean, systems is absolutely a natural part of the way I am, whether or not it's because I studied biology or the reason why I studied biology, I will never know.
Yeah, and if we talk about sustainability as well, it's hugely complex as well. How would you describe what does sustainability mean to you?
Well, sustainability is just, for me, about putting into play the knowledge that we have. To me, it's slightly odd that we put the knowledge associated with sustainability into a separate box, and in a way that it's actually treated and discussed in a separate way. Because the knowledge associated with sustainability is actually the new knowledge that has come perhaps a little later in the industrial process, after things were running so fast that it became problematic to put that knowledge into play. But actually, it's not different knowledge. It's just risk analysis. And actually what is, and maybe I'm leaping now to a later part of our conversation, but one of the things that I'm finding very exciting is that we're starting to discuss risk again, and actually understanding the consequences of your action for the wider system is, to me, it's a fairly obvious thing to do. But part of the way in which we described companies and the way in which we finance companies has made it difficult to put this knowledge into practice. But to me, sustainability is simply about intelligent development in a way that uses the knowledge that we have at hand. And whether it's knowledge about human systems or about natural systems or about the relationship between human and natural systems, it's actually most of the topics of sustainability can simply be described as, let's not mess things up and create problems in the future.
Yeah. And if I try to connect that back to what we said with reductionism, it seems that the approach has been, let's put sustainability in its own little department. Let's have a known head of sustainability that thinks about these things and these things only. But rather, what we're learning, what we're trying to do with the podcast as well, is to integrate the complexity and integrate the systems thinking to understand the whole and understand sustainability, as we've said earlier in this podcast, as well as an umbrella that branches into all other aspects, rather than seeing it as something separate. And I think that view of it can be, I think it's a mature view of understanding how all things are interlinked. And I'm curious there what you said about risk reduction and not messing things up. And with you working in business in those climates, what does it look like trying to actively not mess up?
Well, first of all, I think that the conversation about systems thinking and sustainability has changed dramatically in the past 5 years. There was a time where it was very, very difficult to draw attention to these topics. Even when I was in Unilever, which was before Paul Polman, we were laying the foundation for him to be able to do what he did there by gathering understanding about the interface between the business and the rest of the world, and looking very much at things like water and chemicals and agriculture. So there's a lot of work going on before he joined. But Unilever had a history that was very, very much based in the solving of problems and doing good for everybody, for the large majority of people. So the first products in the two different parts of the business were reliable, high quality soap that was not full of flour or other things that were, bulking up and fooling people. And then that was in the UK, and then in Holland it was about producing reliable cooking fats. And the culture in a company makes a big difference. And so it was easier to talk about not doing harm and taking responsibility there. But even in Unilever at that time, it was difficult to bring in a lot of investment to make changes that were needed. The company was very focused on, obviously, like I think any decent company, not doing anything that was illegal. But when you were going beyond what the law required in the early 2000s, that was it's still a major discussion, because there was a conflict between the financial goals and the financial relationships. And that was very much the streamlined return on investment. That is changing now, and particularly when the financial industry, the financial sector, is beginning to understand that it has a major role to play in making sure we develop in a way that doesn't completely destabilize the planet. So the conversation is getting easier, but it again, even in business, we have reductionism. We've divided the departments. The financial people sit here, the marketing people sit here, research and development. We've divided up the knowledge into boxes and made it difficult for people to talk to each other. And that is the challenge of our time, that our knowledge often is becoming so specialist that you're either an expert or you're ignorant. And I think that's a really difficult problem to resolve. We're seeing it even in politics. Either you're an expert or you're ignorant, and then the conversation becomes crazy. One of the political quotes that absolutely sits in my head is Michael Gove saying the British people are tired of experts or something. I can't remember the exact quote. It's a dangerous situation to be too expert, as I've experienced myself from sitting in an academic organization. You don't have space in your head. You don't have, you're so full of the details of your area that it even limits your ability to be curious about areas that you don't understand. But it's equally dangerous to be unaware of what you don't know.
How would you feel like a company, a best case scenario, how should they work in relationship to sustainability, and how should a business be run, in your opinion?
Well, the most amazing job I ever had was when I moved from Unilever in Italy to the Telberg Foundation in Sweden. And the motto of the Telberg Foundation was, how on earth can we live together? And it was an organization that created conversations that generated insights. And one of the regular group of attendees at our forums and conversations and seminars and things that we created was a team from the company Shell, who were responsible for building the scenarios, their 5-year scenarios. Because one of the main focus of the Telberg Foundation was to try to see reality as it is, and to do that and to create the interconnections between the fairly fragmented global economy. And of course, the actors in a global economy includes the artists and the scientists and the politicians. And we were putting the system into conversation with itself in order to help the people in decision-making positions understand the wider context of their own role and to make more insightful decisions. And that's, I think, the way to move in a complex system where you realize that now we're in such a state, both a sort of neutral use of the word state and the English way of saying we're in a state, which is a difficult position, that every move we make has significant consequences, and not always in places where we see them. And one of the problems with a lot of the environmental challenges is that we've broken some of the feedback loops. If a farmer used too much water, the farm was dry and the farmer couldn't grow anymore. If the hunter killed too many elk, then there would be none for the year after. We've lost those feedback loops. We're doing things where we don't see the consequences. And I think a lot of the modern technologies are trying to close those feedback loops, to allow people to see the consequences of what they're doing. And so in Telberg, we were trying to have conversations between the different parts of the system. And scenarios is one way to have those conversations. And I think scenarios are on their way back into business, encouraged by something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosures. It's a long name, TCFT. But they're asking for scenarios. And I think that risk management the whole risk management processes within business have been the arenas for conversations like that, but often not sufficiently structured, and often, again, attempting to simplify those risks by putting them into boxes and not seeing the links between them.
How would you describe that a bit more closer? How does it work for a company working with different scenarios?
Well, I think the way Shell does it, they use something called the adaptive scenario, where they have an absolutely amazing team of people, really fantastic guys. I don't think they're all guys, but mostly. And they have a computer model in which they try to model the energy markets, try to have all the details of energy supply, all of the pricing issues, the companies and the sovereign energy. And that computer system provides the modeling of how the energy system, which is their particular market, develops. And then they have experts in geopolitics and experts in economics, and they together create through a process of understanding drivers and stories and potential consequences, and they describe a number of scenarios. There's another way of doing scenarios, which also originated, one could say, from Shell, the transformative scenario process, which is developed by a company called Rios, and the founder of Rios is a former Shell scenario team member who worked for South Africa when South Africa was trying to avoid civil war. He's called Adam Kahane. And the transformative scenario process is trying to not just describe potential developments in order to make sure the company or whoever can adapt to whatever's going to happen, but is actually trying to understand where there is potential to actively influence what's happening. And so you do a scenario process also based on what's driving change, but you understand which are the drivers that we can influence, either alone or in collaborations with other parts of the systems, which are the drivers that are just givens. And that way of working puts you into a position of, and I think that for climate change and for other of the big challenges at the moment, they have the potential to emotionally disable you because they're so critical and so frightening. And in my experience, having cried buckets of despair over climate change because I understand it, working in a way that puts you into a role of doing something about it is also a way of managing your emotions. And I think that in scenarios, understanding where you have the potential to interact with the system is really critical. And for companies, you need to feel in the driving seat of your company. You need to be able to say to your investors, we've, in the American phrase, we got this. It sounds awful in English, doesn't it? We understand, and we're doing something about it. And you can only do that if you actually have done the scenario planning. You understand the drivers in your marketplace, the drivers in nature, the drivers in society, the drivers in economics. And if you define the drivers, understand which ones you have some potential to interact with, then you're going to feel stronger, and you're going to have a better dialogue with all of your stakeholders.
And looking, you talked a little bit about it earlier, that you see the expertise or the competence is divided within different boxes within an organization. So looking behind the scenes, would you like to see companies working more integrated with each other? They should sit on the same department, or how should a company work behind the scenes regards to sustainability?
Well, I think it's actually probably about just developing your risk management process and building relationships between departments. I think that the biggest challenge with environmental activism has, and even some of the voices coming out of academia, is to not understand that the business has a business model that is based on cost and delivery. And so demanding that companies, not all companies are so big that they can have multiple people doing one job. In fact, if you look at small to medium-sized companies, you'll find that one person is doing 3 jobs. And so what companies need are processes that clearly define how, throughout the year, they can manage the demands upon them. And they have to see the benefits clearly. And I think that's another advantage of the recommendations from this task force, is that actually it's a tool that I think is of maximum benefit inside the company to understand where they need to start looking at risks. And developing a process around that allows you to achieve that without having to completely reorganize the company and incur costs in terms of either bringing in new people or just taking other people's time. It's actually, I think, for me, the key is about respecting the different actors in the system. And business is a certain kind of actor with a certain constraints. And I think that respecting that as a start point is really critical for sustainability. I think a lot of the companies I've been talking to recently feel that demands on them are coming from all sides, and they have to work out what is the really critical work we have to do on sustainability now, the conversation has moved away from do we have to do this. I think everyone has realized that this is actually it's an essential way of thinking. But then the question is how, and how to do it in the most impactful way.
Can you expand a little bit more on TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures?
Well done. I've never heard anybody say it right for the first time, but maybe it's not the first time. So when I was at Future Earth, which was this global network of sustainability scientists, I became very interested in the relationship between scientific knowledge and how the financial sector was deciding where to put its money. The tool at that time, this was in 2016, 15, 16, was very much the ESG rating system, which is environment, social, and governance rating system, where companies fill in forms and send their internal declarations to usually a company called Rebecca Sam in Switzerland, and they would decide the rating for the companies, and through that you got things like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and other kinds of ratings, and that was really very unscientific, and it was a process that was mainly done sort of on the side of the understanding of the company as a good investment. Over time, a lot of claims were made that good ESG ratings could be correlated with good investments. But as a scientist representing an organization producing an awful lot of knowledge about sustainability, I was thinking, well, how is this knowledge being useful and being put to use? And I talked to a lot of financial organizations, and it was really very difficult because a lot of what the financial world wants is projections. And that's one thing scientists don't like to do. And a lot of the data coming out of science and all the published papers is actually retrospective. It's looking back to try to understand what happened to this species or how do we understand weather or whatever. And it was very, very difficult to see how to link these up. And then I became aware of this task force, which was put together by the Financial Standards Board. And Mark Carney, who was then the head of the Bank of England, and Michael Bloomberg, who I think everybody knows, they sort of championed this task force. And the idea was to try to understand how the risks from climate change could be put into the risks in the financial system. Mark Carney called it the tragedy of the horizons, that the time scale that we used to talk about climate change was too long to make it impactful at all in the decisions made by the financial markets that were made either from second to second or quarter to quarter, and maybe a year, maximum 3 years. And this task force was a mixture of representatives from banks and other financial organizations, and then big business. And my contact in the task force was the former head of sustainability for Dow Chemicals, who is my sort of insider view into how these conversations took place, and the conversations about risk. It was very interesting that the risk conversations in big business and the risk conversations in finance were very different, and they had to talk about what they meant by risk. It was interesting. And what came out of this task force was I think, a very elegant document asking that companies, both financial and non-financial, describe their approach to climate change in 4 areas. 1, governance, how the company board and leadership are looking at climate change, understanding it and dealing with it. How the strategy of the company is looking 5 years ahead, perhaps you can choose. It's not a prescriptive recommendation. How your risk management is how your risk management process is designed, a clear description of that. And then metrics and targets. And the metrics were completely new metrics for the whole, well, for both the business, both non-financial and financial companies. Metrics related to climate change have traditionally been about how the company impacts the climate through declarations of carbon emissions. And that's something that is a sort of an extra metric for the company, that the company can measure and declare and do something with. But for the financial industry, looking at the emissions was an ESG issue. It wasn't a reflection of how risky the investment was. What the TCFD is asking companies to declare is, first of all, also to declare their carbon emissions, but also to declare the financial risk to the company from climate change. And those risks are either the physical risks. Are you going to have to move your factories, and how much is that going to cost? Is your product absolutely dependent on water in a place where there's going to be drought? Those kind of physical risks from climate change, but also risks to the company from the fact that the economy and society are going to change dramatically in the coming decade, because climate change is generating a huge response. So, for example, is your product going to be seen differently by customers or because of climate change? Is the cost of capital, is the cost of raw materials, will there be new legislation? And these are called transitional risks, how the company is financially impacted by transitional risks from climate change. And that's a totally different kind of metric. And companies are really struggling with this. But I think it's kicking off a really interesting conversation within companies.
And what I hear is that it kind of goes against the traditional secrecy and competitiveness among firms, that I guess when you're doing this TCFT, that you're somehow communicating it in your communications and being transparent about it. And that must be really, really scary, and also a risky thing for companies to disclose topics that they perhaps are lacking behind on, or topics that they see big risks in.
Well, I mean, that's just the normal situation for business. You have to think about disclosures that are going to affect your competitiveness, and obviously you are unlikely to declare a risk unless you have a strategy to handle it. So that's also one of the impacts of the TCFD, is that you're going to start looking at management systems for climate, and that will generate other conversations. So, for example, a company operates in a particular area of the world and sees that there may be risk from flooding or risk from landslides. They'll start communicating with the local governments in that area, and so the conversation on climate change will be enriched by having to understand your risks, put a financial impact on them, and understand how you will manage the risk. But you do put your finger on an important point, and I think this is a critical point, not just for the TCFD, but for all of the developments in sustainable finance at the moment. And that is, how are we going to finance the transition? So, of course, a green company will be an attractive investment if you can see that they are filling a need and using green energy, and that's fantastic. But our future will not be made up of companies that are looking fantastically green today. What we need is to finance the transition. And actually, the texts around the EU work on sustainable finance and taxonomy, they talk about that. And the challenge is that the taxonomy at the moment is putting a very clear label on companies within certain sectors. This is a green company. This is not a green company. That is helping finance because they want to know what a green company is and what a brown company is. But it's not helping the brown companies because the brown companies may have a bad profile today and will have to invest in becoming greener. But some of them actually need help and need support and need not to lose their shareholders. And so the conversation about how to finance the transition, I think, is a critical one that neither the EU taxonomy nor the TCFD really address. And so what I'm trying to talk about is dialogue. I was talking to one of Sweden's biggest investor companies, and their head of sustainability was really concerned about the knee-jerk and high-speed reaction of the majority of the financial system. Obviously, you have pension funds, signatories to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, the UNPRI. They have members, and there's a lot of discussion about long-term investors, but there's a lot of short-term investment and fund managers and people who are moving money very quickly. And there's a risk, I think, that, as you say, companies are going to be very scared about what they report if it means a knee-jerk removal of capital. And at the moment, that's not so much a problem because there's not so many green objects. There's more green money that wishes to be green, as we call it in a simplistic labeling speak. There's more money that wishes to be green than green investment objects. But if that starts changing, then I think, we need to ask, is this all going to move money in the way we want it to? Are we going to have sustainable development? Or are we going to have a really one of the ideas behind the TCFD was to try to understand that climate change can destabilize our global economy and destabilize the financial system. Are we going to manage to avoid that? Is what I'm asking. And I think that we just have to keep the conversation going and make sure we discuss this. Otherwise, the big companies will always find ways of saying the right thing. And I think we need to be slightly skeptical and dig deeper and really understand what they are doing. But I mean, I think it's going in a good direction, but I think there are still concerns.
I'm thinking about what I'm hearing is that viewing sustainability within companies as a process and allowing for that process to happen, which in the big financial systems with shareholders and short-term investors can be, as you mentioned, a bit problematic, that the process of sustainability, which is iterative, that's why we call it sustainability development, because it's not, unsustainable and the next 10 years sustainable, because it's a journey with steps. And the process of sustainability can be hard to talk about in a company when you're trying to please your short-term investors, because if you say the wrong things, they can all bug off and invest in another company. So I think that's kind of a dichotomy, to hold both the process, which is long-term, and the money, which can be short-term.
Yeah, but I think that the tools are emerging, and I do think that if you read annual reports or reports from annual shareholder meetings, you can see that investors are wanting to be able to tick certain boxes. And one of the interesting developments in the last couple of weeks is when BlackRock voted against the board and the choice of chairman at Volvo AB, because Volvo had not a sufficient disclosure on TCFD. So I'm hoping that at the moment, it definitely looks like that investors are just wanting to see that companies have done a TCFD exercise, that they have understood the climate risks. The best way to do that is through a proper scenario process. It doesn't have to be a heavy and massive one, but it needs to be good enough so that your investors say, yeah, they're onto it. I'm wondering at which point there's going to be a movement of capital away from companies that are not succeeding in making progress. But I think that, one of the things I wrote down for this conversation was, and I forgot to say at the beginning, one of the earliest things I did was write a lot of stories. And I think that storytelling is going to be critical as we try to work out what a sustainable future looks like. And finding ways to tell stories that are based on both reality and the potential way forward, I think that's going to be critical. And I think that is actually what the TCFD is asking companies to do. Make sure you've got your stories right. Make sure your story about your company's future is a sufficiently realistic one. And then how you have that dialogue with your investors. You can only have a good dialogue if you've got your stories straight. And then when you've got stories coming from your scenarios, when you make a decision, you can just check, is this going to move along the lines that we were wanting to, or is it going to have consequences that take us away from the scenario we want to try to build and into a wrong direction?
Yeah, what comes up for me is like to look at the process with empathy, having a positive mindset around it, and acknowledge that okay, we're currently in this state, but looking forward, we really want to implement sustainable development and honor that, and as you say, like create a story of how we want to reach that endpoint. I think it's hugely important.
Yeah, you made me think about if you look at companies as part of a system, it's easy to look at the value chain in a linear way. But what a lot of people are talking about is our need to move into a circular system. And a circular system is more relationship-based, more complex. And I think that I'm thinking of conversations I had probably about 10 years ago with the recycling industry in Sweden. And they are just one part of a circular system. And they were talking about how the collection and the sorting and the preparation of recycled material was going really, really well. But what wasn't moving and what wasn't growing at that time was the use of recycled materials. So the next chain after them in the system was not fully developed. And I think that that's where we need to have our stories so that we understand and can really work on getting the various parts of the system really active, really playing their role. And that's where we need to have this empathy and respect. If we identify the obstacles that are keeping different players from moving, then we can try to understand how to solve those problems rather than just sort of shouting at industry and saying they're not doing enough. I think that's happening now. And I think that's maybe what was missing a little bit in the past.
I love how we're back at systems levels and looking at how companies, and as you mentioned, the recycling system or the recycling unit needs to be in a functional system rather than in isolation. And it's the same with companies, that the departments need to view themselves as part of a system, and within the business system, within the environmental system. We're coming back to that. And I mentioned that because we're running a bit up on time. So before we end this wonderful episode off, I want to ask you if there's anything that you would like to encourage to our listeners within this decade.
Yeah, I was thinking about this because it's a nice question, and I know that a lot of your listeners are in the generation that are really going to be seeing the quickest change in the coming decades. And so what I think is it's one of the most important things, and it comes a bit from my time at Talberg, is this idea that we're navigating in a really complex adaptive system, which is this interrelationship between human systems and natural systems. And so I would just say, make sure you see yourself as a navigator and have your eyes wide open and read the stars to find the way and feel the wind and the waves and realize that you're going to need to take it all into consideration. And this idea very much from the 90s, maybe the 20th century, is moving away from finding a target and moving to that target. This idea of being goal-oriented and single-minded and moving fast. We're navigating now. And I think that navigating with all our senses, using everything it means to be human in the absolutely biggest sense, with your heart and your senses and your instincts and your principles and ethics, all of it has to be part of your navigation. So navigate as a whole person.
That's great. I really, really resonate with that encouragement. Is there anything that you right now coming up, like after this episode, after 2020, what are you excited about coming up for yourself?
I'm always excited about everything.
Well, that's the spirit.
Yeah, no, I think the pandemic has pressed a bit of a restart button. I think it's reminded us how human we are. I think we need to connect with our sorrow about what a pandemic can do to us as individuals, but also realize that we're in it together. And we need to regroup, because climate change is an even bigger challenge and needs us to be, as I said before, in our full humanity to cope with.
Definitely. And if any of our listeners would come in contact with you or find out more about you, where can they?
You can find me at Purple Ivy, which is in Stockholm.
Beautiful.
Perfect.
So thank you so much for being here today. It was wonderful talking to you, and I hope to speak more with you in the future.
Absolutely. Let's definitely stay in touch, and good luck with everything you're trying to do. I think you have absolutely the right approach.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Have a great day. See ya.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.